Hello, welcome back, everyone. Um, this is a holiday, so not a lot of people around. There is one item on the agenda which I kind of migrated from last time, but I also don't see George on the call. Maybe you have some context on this, Dan, while we still wait for other people. So what George said in on the GitHub discussion was I'm gonna throw the quotes from there. So it's slowing down if it requires input from so many external parties. So he has a concern that on HWI, working on HWI, open sourcing it would slow the team down over there. What do you think about that?
It's a valid concern. Kieran and I were talking about this a little bit as well. I had the concern that we wouldn't really have a good way of testing it if we were trying to do servers that were other than, Google servers or OCP standard hardware right now. And even OCP standard hardware, like we don't have a lot of that sitting around, right? So the other challenge that I was concerned about was if we got contributions, I don't know how we would test those either, right? So I think the input part is part of it, but I think that's the other challenge as well because it tends to go down to the metal much more than some of our other diags do, right? The other maybe point of concern I had was I wasn't sure that other people really even needed it. Because I don't know if they were doing like sort of the data center and the tight integration that we do with our repair systems and things like that. At the end of the day, we do use it as a crutch, to get sensor values and CPU details and things like that. But there's a million ways to get those things. But there's only one way for us to get that stable name. That's sort of the claim to fame here. That's what it really sells.
So on the hardware location, that is something that we need as well. And I think I can speak for the teams here. I see Daniel on the call, though maybe he has an opinion. In both in manufacturing and NPI, there isn't a standard way of addressing hardware in terms of location. So having this as a tool would definitely be, useful. And it comes in a bit as a forcing function as well, if you think about it. So definitely, like I would like to see this being used and all of that, but there's a couple of hoops to jump through with like packaging, releasing, versioning, this whole sidecar thing.
Here's
I
what I would say is if we can get some sort of firm commitment from some of the other folks that they're interested in participating in this and things, like then I think we could probably go out and we can make this stuff happen. But we just need to make sure that it's kind of resourced on both sides. So if we go and we agree to sort of like, changes and things like that, that there's folks there that can kind of help support on each side. I just don't wanna leave you guys with something where you become dependent upon it, and then we're like, "Wow, this is a lot of effort for us," or something like that, right?
No, obviously we should all contribute to it. I see Vincent just joined. Vincent, do you have an opinion on this HWI mechanism to be used internally for us in manufacturing in this case? Dan is kind of asking about a sort of commitment that we would use it and support it. I see your hand, Daniel, as well.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead,
Vincent.
Daniel.
Yep.
No, go ahead.
I think we don't have very good traceability currently from manufacturing to the data center. It would be good to have that, but we need to discuss internally because if we only incorporate this into manufacturing, that doesn't give us any better traceability than we already had, right? We need the whole flow. We need this in manufacturing in the data center so that we actually have that traceability from one side to the other. So I think we need to have some internal discussion on how much adoption this would see before we give an answer.
Okay, and then maybe, sorry to jump in, but to Daniel's specific concern too, this particular thing, when we have that hard coded name we're talking about, it's exactly what Adrian said. It's more of like a location, so it's not fantastic for traceability. Like for traceability, serial numbers and date codes and lot codes and things like that, tend to work better than this sort of persistent name. So it may not help with the particular thing you're concerned about if I understood your concern.
Okay.
Go ahead, Vincent, and I'll go next.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on the move. Not an ideal not an ideal setup. I think the short answer on HWI, because it's not a quick topic, is yeah, there are definitely multiple layers to it. The hardware abstraction interface to the operating system and the hardware in general being one significant one, and the other one being the location identifier. Generally speaking, I think if we've been building a hardware abstraction layer, so looking at HWI and reusing it as it would be contributed to OCP does present a lot of value from as a standalone project. And the location identifier, I think, as Daniel said, the real traceability is across test environments and hardware validation environments. So my short answer is yes, I see a lot of value in having it, but how it comes to be and how it comes to be co-developed certainly has to be taken in consideration. Whether it has to be brewed in-house or has to be made into a cross-organizational industry OCP type project. So
Yeah.
along with
Sorry, go ahead and finish your thought, Vincent. I
yeah,
apologize.
just pretty much a long way of saying I certainly see a lot of value, but devil's in the details on this one because it's more hairy and than the OCP output. But I would absolutely would like to see a partnership and a project exist there because there's value.
Okay, Igor's got your hands up.
Yeah, I have a question. So we are talking about stable device locations right now, and we're talking about it related to hardware interface, but it's not hardware interface that gives this feature of stable paths. It's underlying machine management agent, right? So which is proprietary. So I don't see how hardware interface can contribute to this problem.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking here, Igor, is it only works with Redfish devices. And it would probably also, because ultimately that comes down to the service label that's in Redfish, right? That's the only open way we can do it that I can think of. Everything else is going to be, as you said, it just ultimately drills down to Jesus for us, right? Which is something we could never share. But that being said, there's still probably value for, a standard way of getting sensors and power states and CPU details and memory details and all those other things that we could build in band, right? As opposed to building out of band. The other thing that may be interesting to all as well is sort of all the memory decoding and things like that. When you take a physical address, or I'm sorry, a logical address and get it to a physical address, like everybody tends to need those types of utilities and they're fairly standardized now.
So here's a question. It sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Vincent and Daniel, it sounds to me like we would like to play with this tool a bit before we give like an answer. So my first question is, what is the easiest way to do that? Whether there's some documentation and stuff, or whether we can just pull that bits out of the source code, because right now it's like a dependency in the Bazel build, right? And the second one, both of these are for you, Dan. And the second one, how open are you to changes? Like basically on the same question that George had, if we start working on this tool as a collaboration and we use it again as a kind of a uniformity factor between all of the different implementations so that we end up talking about the same hardware. And we add more stuff to it, like different ways of getting stable locations and different collectors of data and stuff like that. How open is this to changes?
Sure. Okay. So first question, what's probably the easiest way to take a look at it? Because that one's simple. What I would pose is that we basically get you guys access to the API itself, right? So you can kind of see the surface area of the messages going in and the messages coming out. And then we can provide some sample output of sort of what it looks like, right? That way you could at least see, okay, this is what it really does. Does this bias value, right? And then that's something we could do pretty easily without going in and like sanitizing code and things like that, right? The second question is, open to changes. And obviously, if we're all working on it together, we have to be open to changes. Where we're in a different position from you guys is right now, every change to us is impactful, right? We have 115 or 200 diags, whatever it is now, that's basically based on this in some way. Some of those changes, like adding fields and things like that, they're kind of trivial. They don't really impact us at all. Changes to like sort of schema or shape or things like that, like they are fairly significant, right? If they change the contract to the diagnostic, right? If their internal implementation changes, we might not even know the difference. Then it's just a testability problem, right? So I think we would be open. I think ultimately, though, the HWI is, it's a vehicle to enable the diagnostic, right? We would have to probably get with you guys, maybe work with Vincent, and talk to your diagnostics team that's responsible for that, and see if that's something that they're interested in doing. But we can certainly show the initial stuff up front, right? Like, I mean, we can say, hey, take this back. Is there even interest? I was thinking one of the things that we might be able to do, Adrian and Vincent, does it make sense maybe early next year to have like a field day or something? Like I'm happy to come over to Meta or we can bring over a couple of our engineers and see meet with the various teams and see if like there's interest in driving this in Meta, similar to the way we have with some of the other partners that we're working with on this stuff.
So I think you could, we can set this up, and you could also talk to NPI people. So Vincent is in manufacturing, and both of these entities would be relevant.
Yeah, I think it might be the way to go, right? Like, I know that for the SSD diagnostics that Kieran not Kieran, Karen and some other folks were working on, I had heard, I can't remember if it was in this call or another a pathway that I'd gotten the information, was that they were like, well, we're going to do the diag, but we're going to hold off on the OCP part for like a little while. So I was kind of curious to know more about that, but we can talk about that stuff offline.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kieran.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. With respect to what Igor was telling, so this is something I'm not entirely clear either. So the identifiers are something which we sort of build based on whatever mechanism we have, something which is sort of slightly external to hardware interface. The hardware interface mostly just deals with what we have, our hardware info objects. That's sort of like a blob which could contain dev path in our case. It could contain something else. I'm I'm not understanding if we are thinking about having the same kind of identifier across the various usages in our companies, or um, is it that each one has their own version of an identifier here? Because if it's the latter, I think the current shape hardware interfaces should not pose an issue.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What was the former in your example? I heard the latter. I didn't hear the former.
So basically, are we looking at the same kind of identifier, the same identifier across companies, at least the same format of identifiers? Like would other companies also use something like dev path? Is that's not something which I'm very clear about.
I think, you know, whether it's the dev path as we know it or love it now or something similar, the goal is the same, right? Just to find a way to kind of name that physical location. Now, we have to be a little bit careful here, though, because that's really what the DMTF does as well, right? And I don't want to step on their toes or kind of overtake what they're doing. What I really want is sort of the interface to go and get what they would call the service label. For us, that service label hasn't been enough because of the multi-node machines and things like
It could be
our
configurable, right? So
to say is what we were hoping to get with our move to Redfish is sort of like, look, we can go and we can take any, you know, off the shelf hardware and bring it into our data center. We haven't really been able to do that because of this other thing that we have called RedPath and UHM that we've put on top of Redfish to sort of enable that unique ID. But we can talk about how all that works. Our machine management team, they do plan to make that a standard in the OCP now anyway. Whether or not, you know, they'll get interest in, you know, adoption and everything else, that, you know, it's very difficult to predict, but they are planning to open this up. So I think to Kieran's point, we should be able to share this and make it standard if there's a need elsewhere. And it sounds like there is. Kieran, I don't know if that answers your question or not.
It does, but what I was thinking is, do we even need to address that point? Like, if it's sort of a blob, each one's setup, each company's setup uses their version of this identifier, and we shouldn't care except for that.
Okay, let me tell you why I think it might, right? And then I'm sorry, Adrian, I'll let you go next. Is what we've done right now is we kind of took the output format and said, okay, look, you know, here's the standard output format, and then you kind of go and do diags and everything. But you know, the output format without the diag sort of like doesn't offer a lot of value because there's nothing for you to drive you to consume that output format right now and do the work to kind of take advantage of it. I think if we did the HWI in the same way, where we said, like, here's the interface, and then it's up for your implementation and put your blob in there. I think it's almost the same thing, right? Like, it's like, here's the interface and standard, but we're not giving you anything to make you kind of pull it in. That's sort of my viewpoint. I may be wrong.
My sense is the lot of the value of the hardware interface is about providing that functionality of getting various pieces of information, and also sort of, you know, it's the interface, the responses for various things like CPU, DIM, all of that is sort of standardized. We can count a lot of on that. The identifier is one part of it, but there is a lot more which is coming from the hardware interface.
Okay, it
So
is definitely true, right? I think the reason I'm focusing on that one thing so hard is for all the other things, there's like a lot of ways to do them, right? Like there's only one way I know to do the other thing. But your point is valid. Like even if you just get fans and temperatures and serial numbers and everything else, it's still very useful, right?
my only concern is this a large enough problem that trying to standardize this will sort of become like a stumbling thing to adoption? Or should we just sidestep that and try to use the other functionality?
If we did the other functionality, then I think what you would propose is that we would have the hardware interface, we would have the sort of Redfish implementation and what we're currently calling the on-host implementation, which would be like wrappers around standard Linuxy things, right?
Mhm.
Um, and then that's what we would ultimately open source and provide. Is that your thought?
Uh, yes.
Okay.
Rough.
Yeah, then the only thing we would have to figure out, and it doesn't seem insurmountable to me, would be, okay, how do we open source something that does that, but internally we have the backend implementation that uses sort of RedPath and that query to get us the little magic string that we care about, that we believe that other folks may not want to get hung up on, even though, you know, Daniel's saying, yeah, we do need something like that, right? But I agree that that's the hard part. Anyway, sorry, Adrian, you've had your hand up patiently for like 20 years now.
It's fine. I'm patient. So the way I see this is it would have value even as a migration path. If we're all driving towards like Redfish, DMTF kind of representation and location representation for hardware, this being a migration path in that it is an abstraction on top of some black box that just gives you this information right now, which essentially is part of the spec. Like the spec says this is the hardware info object and this is the location, but how you define the location is unspecified. So if there's a tool to actually provide that, it would be obviously releasing friction in the adoption in DIAGs. So if we have this, like even as an intermediate of this abstraction with various plugins behind it to gather the data, but eventually we get to Redfish, I still think that would be useful.
Yeah, it might. And, I think your point is valid about sort of the transition phase, because that's really how we're using it. We're using it sort of a transitory path to move from an in-band agent to an out-of-band agent with Redfish, right? So that we can kind of support old things and support new things and not have all kinds of different sets of code.
So that brings us to the question of, do we invest time in this thing right now? And we can deal with that after we have some sort of meeting demo exploration on it, right?
Yeah, I think it kind of comes down to like, let's come up with a very simple example. Like if we wanted to write a generic I don't know, we'll just say like a fan test, right? Like, there's a lot of ways you could do that. You could do that with the hardware interface, or you could do it without the hardware interface. Like most people have a way to go and get that data. The question is, would it make it easier and make the DIAG more portable? I think it probably would. I mean, what do you think, Kieran? Kieran is flummoxed.
Sorry, I was disturbed here. I lost the last bit.
I hear the disturbance in the background.
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you repeat what was the question?
Yeah. So the question is, like, we were coming up with a real world example, right, to make this a little bit less abstract. And I came up with, the simple like fan test, just because it's an easy thing to say. Like, you set a value, read an RPM, set a value, read an RPM. You could do that with or without the hardware abstraction interface, right? Like at the end of the day, most of those things are doing like an echo 50 to something in /sys/ blah, 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 right? You don't need the hardware interface, but it does make it easier.
Yeah, I mean, because of using the hardware interface, we are far removed from doing that echo to whatever devices. We
Yeah.
could certainly go down to that, but this, I mean, for what it's worth, before with Jesus and now with Redfish, we have the same kind of interface. We are sort of oblivious to it. Has its pluses and minus. I'm sort of, at least when I think of hardware interface, for me, it sort of makes me think like it's like a POSIX API, like it's some sort of standard to which people code. Obviously, the hardware info we have is like way more complicated and probably less elegant than POSIX. But that is sort of, at least the direction which I would think makes, in the sense of how I would think HWI as a standard makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, I think we need to get Monish's opinion as well. And then, the way you put it, sort of like if it's a Linux only solution, I think we'd be better off driving this under the LSF, right? I did go out and look, and there are lots and lots of things that have started trying to do this, but it doesn't look like anyone's finished it, which is kind of I don't know. This particular field of study is littered with corpses, what I would say.
We don't want to start another migration.
Yes.
Okay, so let's get back to this in January and maybe set up an additional call specialized on this topic. Yeah, go ahead, Vincent.
Yeah, maybe a quick one, and this probably was the way you opened up the call, and I missed it today. So my apologies. Let me know if that's the case. But going back to obviously the post you made on the GitHub discussion, Adrian, and pairing that with George's comments on Slack, did we cover here the concerns that George has around specifically the Python binding of anything, any DIAG that is getting contributed by Google because that is a very actionable question and very valid point that George raised. Is like, hey, I want to contribute my gray diag. I just need a place to stick the Python to use the HWI. Where do I put it? I feel like in this discussion we've kind of exploded this topic, and I want to make sure we don't lose track of the contribution of the diagnostics just on that point. So was that discussed or?
No, not that particularly. But what I would say is, if we get back in January on the topic of adoption for this, then we can start talking about technicalities like that one, because that's like an implementation detail of how we actually publish, package the thing and use later on.
Do we have, my question is around, like what I would hope we discuss more in January is around the contribution model and how do we treat HWI as possibly a sub project of our collaboration. But if are we gating some work and contributions to diagnostic that wouldn't need to be open? So what I keep going back to in my view of this is, if I look at HWI as a part of a diagnostic that's kind of closed source, so to speak, or just a blurb, again, going back to your points in the GitHub discussion, that this is part of a build system, is there anything that we can do to kind of unblock contributions to the diags without promoting HWI to a common, in its as a common layer of OCP diag, or are we really tied to figuring this out before somebody can make a diag contribution that has an HWI not folder but module, let's call it?
Mm-hmm. As far as contributing a diag that uses HWI, I would say that we are a little blocked till we figure it out, but like I don't think it's hard to figure out, right? The other question about, like, are you blocked from doing a diag? Well, we're not, because we've done it many times without it, right? The only thing that would prevent us from using, or the only blockers, like, we would not be able to use that kind of diag in our data center. But I don't think that's a huge deal either, right? The concern is, if we make a whole bunch of diags and then we decide to go and then introduce HWI and those diags don't use that, then we kind of have, technical debt sitting out there, right?
That's why I'm saying, let's deal with the adoption aspect first and then go into technical details.
Okay, so is George on the call? I'm sorry, I don't know. I can't see if he is.
I think George is OO today. I think he's already on vacation.
Okay, so there wasn't anything. Was there something very specific to Python, to the HWI Python sort of native or not necessarily native, in his question? Because that was my understanding of his problem was where do we put the Python binding of HWI, right?
His problem is, how do you build it? Like, if you have Bazel bringing it in, where do you put the Bazel, right? And obviously it needs to be in the application that is consuming the HWI, because it needs to build it right now. I did not read the post that you're thinking of, but just having talked through this so many times, I'm assuming that's the topic.
So this is in the embedding case.
Yeah.
There were other options, right, that we were discussing, like the sidecar thing or a separate service, in which case the language doesn't matter anymore. That's why I'm saying, if we want to go into those details, we can, but I don't think it's useful right now, considering that we don't have this commitment discussed yet.
Yeah, I think the thing that would make this a little bit more fruitful is getting the alignment on the business needs immediately, right? And then we can decide, well, hey, if we want to deliver these things and have a common version of this and what hardware it needs to run on, then we can come back and say, okay, how do we want to get there? As opposed to sort of figuring out the implementation and then figuring out, okay, how do we plan to use it?
Okay, so maybe my last question. Sorry to keep noodling on this one, Adrian. And I really appreciated your post in the GitHub discussion. It was really well framing the problem well. But do you, what you've looked at with HWI, do you think, given that it's already been in the OCP diag, the C++ folders, I mean, it's out there for us to use. If somebody were to use a Python diagnostic and start writing using the OCP TV libraries, is there a path for somebody to play with HWI? Or
There is,
Okay.
but specifically for us, we cannot use these diags in the data center because they are not auditable due to the build system, right? So the way the whole C++ code base gets built now with Bazel, you would have to like have an external build system that gives you a binary artifact, and then you put that in along with Python bindings, which then makes it unusable. But if you just want to play with it, then yeah, I mean, just set up a Docker or something and build the DSO, and then you can just use it.
Can I ask a question about that, Adrian? And by the way, we're over time too, if anybody needs to go. But what is it that makes it non-auditable? You have all the source code. Is this an artifact of the way your auditing works? It needs to be built in a particular way, or
So everything needs to be built from source is basically the constraint.
I think most people
If you
that.
have like an intermediate step that builds a binary and then you use that binary later on, an SO, for example, in this case, then auditability gets lost like in the middle there.
Does that mean then that and feel free to say I'm not allowed to say, at Meta then there can be no shared libraries? Everything has to be sort of statically linked?
I don't know if I'm allowed to share that or not.
Fair enough. Well, I can
Yeah,
share. I could say that as long as we had the source code for the SO and we have sort of the second level traceability, we would be okay there. I guess the question is, would that be the same for Meta?
So I agree with you. I can ask about this specifically. I know some management people, I guess, but normally I would agree with you. What I'm seeing so far in patterns is that if you have that interruption with like the second trace of auditability, that is kind of iffy.
Okay. Well, I could see a million reasons why they may not want to have that, right? Like when you're dealing with like uber giant code bases from a billion people, like it does help to have sort of that static build so you can add traceability and, debug symbols and everything all the way through, right?
Yeah. Okay. Very quickly.
Let's take this for for next actions. What we'll do is we'll do a little presentation, either probably the week following the week we get back, because I don't want to put everybody on the spot over the holidays, and then we can show you what we have now, and we can do a little bit of a deep dive in the HWI.
Yeah, we can set this up in the next meeting, the next call. Very quickly, do we have any updates that anyone wants to share? Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, very quickly, just want to let you know, as of last week on the latest release of Fava, I basically opened the floodgates and all Fava tests are now generating OCP output. What they generate is the automatic portion of it. So at the start of the test, they will do the test start, test run start, then the test step for different parts of the test. So the test writer basically doesn't have to care about anything. And I have also given them the option of outputting specific OCP measurements, like specific OCP messages like the measurements, but that would need changes to the tests themselves. So we are starting to see some minor issues, working through them, but basically everything in Fava is now generating OCP output.
It's
That is
awesome.
very nice. Yeah, thanks for that update, Daniel.
Sure.
Igor, you have a hand up?
Oh yeah, about memtester, I released a release, and it's just basically source code that GitHub automatically releases, and I made a zip archive that I uploaded as a binary. Well, GitHub calls it a binary. I also included source code there and a version of memtester that I compiled for x86-64. Is that what we needed when we talked about this last time?
I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I had a question. I think the answer is yes, but for your particular binary that was created, was that built and packaged on GitHub, or did you build it locally and then upload it to GitHub?
I built it locally. I wanted to do it in an automatic way, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. So as a temporary solution, I just built it manually.
I was gonna say the same thing, Dan. I can help you, Igor, on that one to build everything in like a GitHub action and publish it from there.
Oh, that would be very nice. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think is what we need, right? I don't know if people are gonna take the weird binary that they can't reproduce, right?
Like this is the opposite of auditability.
Igor's Bitcoin mining empire.
I'm kind of curious, maybe Rajat, is there any updates on CTAM that you might want to share? We haven't heard about that in a while.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've had like back-to-back conflicts, and then I got a lot of them canceled today, so I made time. And NVIDIA, so it's the collaboration on CTAM has primarily been between NVIDIA and Microsoft so far, but we have Meta and AMD onboarding as well. We have the GitHub loaded with onboarding documents and also all the necessary help file. One thing that we started exploring from a month ago was the scoring scheme. You have test cases. We have our test cases categorized based on what we call compliance levels, which basically is how important the test case is relatively, right? So and then we have a scoring format that we were exploring, which is in a couple of scoring formats, and we are letting everyone choose what they want to report. But I was just wondering if the thought of scoring has ever been discussed in this forum before, and a scheme for scoring.
I don't know that we've discussed it here, but we discuss it internally all the time.
No, it came up here as well, but it was like a year ago, and I think it was like, let's do something more useful.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of probably we're letting every I mean, depending on who's the consumer of the tool, we're letting them decide, giving them options on how to on a couple of scoring formats, and we're letting them decide how they want to. We're giving them the flexibility on defining the weightage and scoring as well, scoring schemes as well. So we've had a lot of these changes in already. As I said, we're still in the developer branches. We are in a state now where we could actually move it to the main branch as well. And yeah, that's about what we have.
Rajat, just at a super high level, like TLDRs, your scoring formula essentially where you take some weight and then you multiply it by like either 0 or 1 based on whether or not the test passed.
Correct. So within that you have two ways. You can normalize. You can give it a static weight per level, per test case level. Meaning, if it's an L0 test case, for example, you would choose a high weightage, an L1 somewhere in the middle, and L2 somewhere less, and the rest we give an L3 weight, which is like 0, right? You're just running it just out of interest. That is one way. Another way is if you break down 100 into like say 50, 35, 15, and you say L0 is 50, where if you have certain number of test cases under L0, it will be 50 divided by that number of test cases would be the weight of every one of those L0 test cases.
Okay, I understood everything except the L0. What does that mean?
L0 is like the highest priority test case that we have
Okay, gotcha. Okay, understood.
as
So-
against L3, which is the least. L2 is the least, but L3 is like.
So in this case, if all of the L0 passes, then your score is already at least 50.
Exactly, right? The idea is this: when we have these products coming out in the market, right? You can think of the compliance tool being used broadly in two phases. One is the phase where we're interested in, which is post-production. But the compliance tool also is of use pre-production, and it's in this phase where you want to get to 100, but you know the product is not mature enough to get to 100. Right? So we want to provide an organic way and also kind of like a standardized way in which we reflect the true state with respect to compliance again of the product.
Yeah, I
So-
like the idea. The one thing to mention, obviously not to dissuade us away from this, there was an OCP redfish profile compliance project. I don't know if you guys remember that from like 2021, maybe. We should go and see how much adoption and things that has kind of gotten, because it's to solve a very similar problem, right? Like, is your BMC or your management agent compliant with like the OCP requirements, and see what they have done there.
So I've come across two such DMTF projects. One is called the Service Validator. A lot of you might be aware of it. The other one is there's something called an interoperability validator. The Service Validator just validates the schemas that you have that the device slash firmware exposes. As against the interop validator, you can actually say you want a profile to be like this, and you specify those specific properties and their conditional requirements, and then you say that okay, this is how this is you expect the device to comply to these profiles, right? So you have investigated into these two, and we have kind of integrated a couple of them. We've integrated the Service Validator already into our compliance tool. It's like we expect passes even when you run the Service Validator. A separate discussion again on that. And interop validator is the next thing we want to use. Where, say, in case the OCP interface spec says, I want to have these properties compulsorily across all vendors, right? You want all of them to expose, say, for example, inside the Redfish service route, you want all of them to expose firmware inventory. Update service and update service, you want them to expose the firmware inventory. You can define that as a requirement in a profile, and we can reuse the interop validator there. Again, that will spawn a separate story, but long story short, we have explored on these two sides. Outside of these two, if you if you're aware of anything else, I would definitely like to take a look at it.
No, what you described on the interop validator, that's exactly what the OCP Redfish project was attempting to do. Their whole TLDR was that, Redfish was simply too large. Let's go and like water it down to just the mere essential things that we need for what is a compliant OCP server. And it did seem like they made some fairly smart choices. Like you mentioned, firmware update and things like that. They were all there, but it was more of a way to sort of like, to be 100% compliant is daunting, right? Like, what is the bare minimum everybody needs?
Correct. So there's spec level discussions that are happening, and I would like to drive a spec-based validation, where I want the spec to define the profiles, and as far as in the compliance tool, will just consume those profiles and add it to the tool, and we just validate against those profiles.
So Rajat, on the scoring function, everyone has an opinion. So I would strongly suggest that you start a GitHub discussion item if that's not already there, and that's a place for opinions.
Sure. I'll do that.
Thank you. Just want to confirm with you, since I know some people from Meta are looking at this, have you spoken to either Venkat, Karen, or Anil?
So the onboarding doc is what I've shared the onboarding doc, and I'm in touch with Venkat as well. He's making incremental progress, and that is also a learning for me, because as of now, since we are still early in this aspect of manageability compliance, every vendor is still building stuff in their own ways. We can't really say we can't really demand everyone to right away comply, right? It'll take time.
Okay.
But so as a result, we have a lot of customizations, and as a result of the customizations, onboarding, expecting everything to be made available right from the get-go becomes really tough. So instead, we created this onboarding document where we go stepwise, and it's where we say, okay, first you run this, and then you run this, and then you run this. So like you have like 10, 20, 10, 15 steps where you don't need all the requirements and all the reference JSON files or reference collaterals right from the get-go, but the onboarding document will help build that and get you more involved in getting your setup ready to run the full compliance tool over time.
Right. So one question I encountered, I made the code base available internally for us and the internal compilation process. And there was a question around building some specifics. I don't recall right now, but what I'm gonna say is, if you have any discussion on building things or requirements, please pull me into those discussions.
Oh, yeah. So, you mean in terms of, gotcha. Yeah. So, and I've been encouraging Venkat to like, let me know as the moment he's stuck anywhere, I'm more than willing to help out there.
Yeah, like continue to work with Venkat, and we're still in the exploratory phase, if I remember correctly from the roadmaps. Okay, thanks for the update, Rajat. I think we are basically on time. If anything else needs to be raised right now.
Just happy holidays, everyone. I gotta run. Good conversation. I was only planning to be here for 30 minutes, but it was interesting, so stuck around. But I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Everybody be safe and have a great new year, and I'll see you soon.
Happy holidays.
Happy New Year.
A reminder,
Happy
the next
holiday.
one is, the next meeting is on January 10.
Sounds
Awesome.
See you
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Holiday.